In 2018, as the archivist and historian for the Duxbury Rural and Historical Society, I embarked on a quest to discover local women who had traveled to sea with their husbands aboard merchant ships during the 19th century. At the time I started my research, I knew of 4 or 5 women who had done so, and I anticipated finding at least a few more. I discovered was over 40 women who were either from Duxbury or married to a Duxbury mariner. For some, I was able to discover fascinating stories, what ships they traveled on, and their destinations. For others, I only have their name and the knowledge that at least once they went to sea. Finding them was not always easy. Their names do not show up in the business records, log books, or crew lists of the time. Many were discovered in personal letters, some in vital statistics. For example, if a child was born at sea, there's a good chance their mother was there too. Census records yielded a few clues, as did contemporary newspapers, and also secondary sources and personal reminiscences by relatives or descendants. Now, speaking of vital statistics, of the women and children who went to sea, there were 9 births, 2 marriages, and sadly, 5 deaths. These deaths include both women and children. When children were born at sea, they were often given interesting names. Seaborn, for example, was born at sea. Manilus was born aboard the ship of the same name. And this little girl on the left, Rio de Janeiro Windsor, was born, you guessed it, in Rio. The young woman on the right is Minnie Windsor Bradford. She grew up sailing with her father, Captain Charles Windsor. As a teenager, she sailed around the Horn to San Francisco with her parents aboard the clipper ship Continental. Once there, she fell in love with a dashing captain of a United States Coastal Survey ship. The two wed, and Minnie transferred her bags from one ship to another. She then spent years at sea with her husband, Captain Gershom Bradford, in the Coastal Survey. Before moving on to their voyages, I want to take a brief moment to give some background to Duxbury's maritime history. Although it is a waterfront community, Duxbury was only building small vessels, mostly for the fishing trade, prior to the American Revolution. It wasn't until after the Revolution, when America needed its own large merchant fleet to begin trading around the world, that Duxbury became one of the largest shipbuilding centers in the country. Between the late 1700s and until the mid-1840s, Duxbury built over 800 ships. Ezra Weston II, also known as King Caesar, was considered by some to be the largest shipbuilder in the country. The Weston firm alone built over 100 ships. The financial crash of 1837, the shallowness of Duxbury's Bay, and the migration of shipbuilding to East Boston all conspired to end Duxbury's shipbuilding era. By the 1850s, there was no building here to speak of, although a couple firms attempted to stay afloat rather unsuccessfully. When we describe Duxbury's shipbuilding era, we usually talk of the great merchant owners of the yards, the shipwrights, the carpenters, the caulkers and riggers, the sail and rope makers, along with the captains and the sailors. By definition, this is a very male-dominated history. Women enter into the story as waiting wives, if at all. So to find over 40 women who went to sea, well, that puts them directly onto the ships and into the narrative. Even aboard the Hope, the largest merchant ship launched in 1841, carried a woman named Nancy Soule. Knowing that so many went to sea changes the way we perceive Duxbury as it was in the 19th century. This graph shows the number of voyages I found per decade. Some women went on a single voyage, some a few, and some spent the majority of their married lives at sea. What you notice about this graph, however, is that despite the fact that Duxbury's shipbuilding era was going strong during the first 40 years of the 19th century, we have very few voyages in the earliest decades. Why is that? Well, the answer is threefold. First, there were very few primary sources that I could draw upon from the first 20 years of the 19th century. Even so, I do believe that if I had more information, the number of women would still be low. This is due to the fact that it was very dangerous to be at sea during the early years of our republic. Between 1799 and 1815, there was the quasi-war with France, followed shortly by President Thomas Jefferson's embargo during the Napoleonic Wars, and finally the War of 1812 against Great Britain. Throughout this tumultuous time, Duxbury vessels continued to go to sea, but it would have been unwise to take your wife aboard and expose her to additional dangers. But I believe there is a cultural reason for such low numbers as well. The women who were married to mariners in the earliest years of the 19th century had not grown up in a maritime economy. There was no precedent for them to go to sea. Their mothers certainly had not. So it is not until the dangers at sea had died down, and we get to the second generation of mariners' wives, women who had grown up watching their fathers and now brothers, cousins, and neighbors heading to sea, that we begin to see an uptick in voyages. By the 1840s, even as Duxbury's shipbuilding era was on the wane, many mariners still called Duxbury home. It was assumed wives would and could go to sea at that point if they chose. The middle to late years of the century saw the rise of the great merchant ships heading on years-long voyages to the Pacific and the China trade. This was the time in which wives were likely to join their husbands, often with children in tow, transferring their domestic lives aboard ships. The end of the century saw the end of the great age of sail, but more importantly for our story, Duxbury was simply not producing any more mariners. The economy had completely changed, and the only merchant sea captains were the old salty dogs rocking on their front porches. Our first story is that of Sally Drew Bradford, who went to sea with her husband, Captain Daniel Bradford, in September of 1809 aboard the Hercules. At the time of the voyage, the Bradfords had two young daughters, who they left in the care of Sally's family. During the voyage across the Atlantic, the Hercules was dismasted in a terrible hurricane. To her sister, Sally wrote the following: "A few minutes before the masts went, I went up the stairs and looked on deck. It was so dreadful that I had scarce strength left to get back to the cabin. I saw Mr. Bradford give his orders with as much calmness as at any other time. When I heard the masts go, I had not the least idea of living but a few minutes. My strongest sensations were that my sweet Emily and you all would look for our return, and that you would never see us. I tried to compose myself with the thought that I should die with my husband, and it was out of my power to do so. If ever I live to get home, it will do me good. I shall not easily forget it, and many other trials we have had." Once the storm had abated, the crew jury-rigged a mast, and the Hercules began limping to safety. The disabled ship was eventually taken as a prize by the British ship of the line Ramillies and brought to England. I've often wondered what the Bradfords must have talked about as they made their way back to America. Perhaps they discussed Daniel's career choice. For upon returning to Duxbury, the Bradfords sold their house on Harrison Street and bought a large tract of land in Keene, New Hampshire, where they built a similar house, and Daniel became a gentleman farmer. The Bradfords had 5 more children, but the seafaring gene must have been strong in the family, for 2 of their sons returned to Duxbury and became mariners. Now we come to the honeymooners. I use this term loosely. These women did not leave for sea with their new husbands immediately after taking wedding vows. Rather, they went to sea at some point in the early years of marriage, before settling down to a household and children. For some honeymooners, it was one and done, never to go to sea again. For others, it was merely the first of many voyages. Here we have 2 of Duxbury's honeymooners. On the left we have Jane Windsor, who married her cousin, Captain Gershom Windsor, thus making her Jane Windsor. It was not uncommon in the small town of Duxbury to find cousins marrying. It is through Captain Windsor's letters at the Duxbury Free Library that I learned of Jane's voyage early in her married life. She went with her husband on a voyage aboard the ship Amulet from Richmond, Virginia, to Bristol, England, carrying a load of tobacco. But what we really learn from Gersham's letters is just how much a husband could value the companionship of a wife on board. When I started this research, I was focused on what a woman would get out of going to sea. What would be her motivations? Gershom reminded me that husbands often wanted their wives with them as well. A master mariner's life was difficult. They were responsible for the ship, its cargo, and the lives of their crew. It was a stressful occupation. Having a wife on board could ease that stress and loneliness. Gershom took particular pride in Jane's fortitude as they crossed the stormy Atlantic, and in her independence as she went out in Bristol, while Gershom managed the cargo and repairs to the Amulet. Here are Gershom's own words in a letter to his brother. My wife Jane is very well, and sends her respects to you, and says you must go and see her mother as soon as you get to Boston, and tell her she is happy as a clam. I am going out shopping with her today for the first time since here. She goes every day alone, or gets someone to go with her, and knows the way all about Bristol. She begins to think she will want a few things in the housekeeping line. She enjoys herself very well, and glad as yet that she came. My wife is the prettiest woman in Bristol, and sits now beside me, making drawers. Sadly, after 14 years of marriage, Captain Gershom Windsor died off the coast of the Carolinas, leaving Jane a widow with 5 children. She became the frugal and determined matriarch of her family. Her granddaughter, Mary Nye Gifford, was one of the founding members of the Duxbury Rural and Historical Society. On the right, we have Marcia Packard, painted in 1831 by artist Cephas G. Thompson. Marcia was the daughter of a sea captain named Henry Packard, and her mother was an Alden descendant named Mercy Alden. The Packards lived in a house that stood on the site of today's Percy Walker Pool in Duxbury. In 1836, she married Captain Robert Welch, then the captain of the largest ship yet built in Duxbury, the Eliza Warwick. To be in command of such a large vessel, you would think he was a proficient and talented captain, and yet one of Marcia's neighbors, Captain Freeman Sole, said of him that he was, quote, "the biggest liar and the biggest fool he ever met," end quote. Notwithstanding Captain Sole's opinion, Marcia was excited to be married and embarking on a voyage that would culminate in her shopping in London. But according to Charlotte Bradford, a close friend, here is what happened to poor Marcia on her voyage. Marcia has met with a sad accident during her voyage. The 6th day out, they had a very severe gale, and the worst time that Captain Welch ever knew. It was a very bad time, and the vessel was thrown on her beam ends, came very near oversetting, and Captain W. was thrown down, struck his head, and put his little toe out of joint, and was otherwise injured. He was carried to the cabin senseless, wherefore Marcia got out of her berth thinking he was dead, and then the vessel rolled and sent her across the cabin. She then got into bed and had a crying spell, and then she got up and helped set her husband's toe and do it up. As soon as it was done, there was a trunk got loose and come against it again and put it out again. Captain W. was confined to the cabin 5 days, and when he arrived at Mobile, had not been able to wear a boot or a shoe. After this, they struck the Bahama banks and lost 2 anchors, so that poor Marcia's voyage, in which she did not expect any bad weather, has turned out rather sadly. Eventually, Captain Welch retired from the sea, and he and Marcia settled down in Brooklyn, New York, with their adopted daughter. This is Sally Freeman Dawes. It is from her letters in our Dawes family collection that I learned so much of Duxbury mariners' wives in the 1840s. Sally so desperately wanted to go to sea with her husband, Captain Josephus Dawes, that she often wrote to him of the women she knew, including her sister and sister-in-law, who were embarking on voyages. Sally was born on Standish Street in Duxbury in 1815. When she was 26 years old, she married Josephus Dawes. He had been to sea since he was 7 years old, and at the time of their wedding was sailing in the Mediterranean fruit trade for the Holmes family in Kingston. Because he was away so often, Sally estimated that in their first 2 years of marriage, they only saw each other a total of 4 months. During their long periods of separation, Sally would become despondent and ill, often visiting doctors and even a mesmerist. She relied heavily on a medicine she referred to as the panacea, which was probably an alcohol or laudanum-based patent medicine. When letters arrived, however, that seemed to promise that Sally could go on Josephus's next voyage, her mood became brighter as she interviewed other seafaring wives and packed her sea trunk. The following are excerpts from her letters. Notice the frequent mentions of other women. 1843. Oh, my dear husband, it is just a week this very hour since you left me, and never can I tell you what I have suffered since that time. I find I never knew what it was to part with you before. It seems as if I must see you when it comes night, but when I think you are torn from me, it seems as if my heart would break, and I feel as if I was left alone in the world. Oh, Josephus, I miss you more and more every day. You must make up your mind to take me with you on your next voyage, for I can't be left behind again. I don't care anything about the accommodation. I feel lonesome enough. It seems as if all was happy but me. My sister is fixing to start Wednesday. Oh, what I would give if I could only go with you. And she continues, I must talk a little more about going with you. I hope you won't disappoint me, for I have been packing my sea chest today, and how pleasant it would be for me to come with you. Captain Joshua Drew has taken his wife and one child with him. In fact, most all the women have gone to sea. But if you don't let me go, you must come home. Oh, Josephus, you don't know how miserable I am when separated from you. We have had letters from Nancy quite often. She wrote me to go to sea by all means, for she liked it first rate. But I'll try to do as you think, for you are a better judge than I. Let everyone that has husbands to sea say they would go. Eventually, Sally did go to sea with her husband, including aboard the clipper ship Annie F. Weston to the Pacific, bringing her children with her as well. The Dawes house still stands at 158 Tremont Street. This is the story of Beulah Holmes Wadsworth, the wife of Captain Alexander Wadsworth. Before her last fateful voyage, Beulah had been to sea with her husband on at least 2 other occasions. In 1852, she set sail with her husband and 9-year-old son Frank aboard the ship Seth Sprague, loaded with a cargo of New England ice, bound for India. You can see them here on the stern of the ship in this watercolor. A few weeks into the voyage, Beulah discovered she was pregnant. The expectation was that the ship would be safely in port when the baby was delivered. But Beulah had a difficult pregnancy. She was unwell with more than seasickness when the ship rounded the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. When the ship finally arrived in Madras, India, however, she was feeling better. The family checked into a local hotel, and Beulah and Frank saw the local sights. When the Seth Sprague got under way for a short 4-day trip across the Bay of Bengal to Calcutta, Beulah was once again sick, this time with dysentery. As the ship lay becalmed on the sea for 30 days, Beulah's condition worsened and she went into labor, delivering a son that they named Alexander Seaborn Wadsworth. Unable to nurse the baby, it was given over to sailors who fed it on goat's milk. After 7 harrowing days, in which her husband never left her side, Beulah died. Captain Wadsworth did not want to bury his beloved wife in India and was determined to see her body home to Duxbury, using any means at his disposal. Here are his own words of the experience from a letter written to his sister, Catherine Wadsworth drew, still in the family's private collection. I had a coffin made on board and put her in it, and having some spirits on board for cargo, I got at that and filled the coffin with it, and was thus enabled to bring her here 1 week after her death. Since I have been here, I have had a leaden coffin made, enclosed with wood, and put the original one in, and soldered it up perfectly airtight on board ship. Thus I hope to bring the dear remains of my dear departed wife home with me, if God ever permits me to return, and deposit them in the old churchyard of her native village. The little babe she never nursed. Fortunately, we had a goat on board. The little fellow was 12 days old when we arrived here, and was as bright and healthy as possible. He used to wake up every 2 or 3 hours, and would feed well and go to sleep again. Very little trouble. Since I have arrived here, I've engaged a wet nurse for him, a native woman, and Mrs. Walker has kindly taken him under her care. After departing Calcutta, the goats ended up washing overboard, and the wet nurse was too sick to continue the voyage, and so she was put off the ship. The baby, Seaborn, was eventually fed on nothing but hardtack crackers softened with water, and yet he survived. The ship eventually made its way back to Massachusetts, and Beulah was laid to rest in Mayflower Cemetery. Seaborn, despite his difficult start, lived a long life in Duxbury, even going to sea for a time with Captain Josephus Dawes. He married and had 6 children, dying at the age of 81 in 1934. Lucy Bradford Nickerson was the daughter of Ephraim Bradford and Lucy Peterson. She was raised on Powder Point, as her father managed King Caesar's rope walk. In 1850, she married Captain George F. Nickerson. It's unknown if she traveled with him as a young bride or mother. What we do know is in 1878, she was suffering from what was diagnosed as a liver complaint. A bracing voyage at sea was considered a good remedy, so she left Massachusetts along with her 18-year-old daughter, also named Lucy, aboard her husband's ship, Nereid. After 120 days, the ship arrived in Australia, and Lucy was feeling much better. The voyage seemed to be doing the trick for her health. The Nereid then made for Yokohama, Japan. Once there, the younger, teenage Lucy fell in love with an American clerk named Theodore Morris. She desired to remain in Japan and marry Theodore, but her parents insisted she continue the voyage with them. But they promised that once back in Duxbury, if she still felt the same, she could return to Japan. As the Nereid then traveled to Chile to pick up a load of sodium nitrate, also called saltpeter, and used for fertilizer, Lucy began to feel the effects of her illness once again. As the Nereid rounded Cape Horn in a stormy weather, Lucy died. Now, just as Captain Wadsworth had done 20 years earlier, Captain Nickerson found a way to preserve his beloved wife's body. He did not have liquor, but what he did have was saltpeter. He fashioned a coffin and packed Lucy's body into the fertilizer. When the Nereid reached Liverpool, England, the customs officials insisted that the captain bury his wife in England. He refused, so the officials inspected the coffin, and they found Lucy's body perfectly preserved. Captain Nickerson was able to bring her back and bury her in Mayflower Cemetery. She was laid to rest not too far from Beulah Wadsworth's grave. As for the younger Lucy Nickerson, true to his word, Captain Nickerson sent her safely back to Yokohama. She took an overland train to California, where a Duxbury friend met her and put her on a packet to Japan. She married her Mr. Morris, and they remained in Japan for 18 years, eventually joined by Lucy's younger sister, Helen. When the trio moved to California in 1902, they established the Nippon Mura, a Japanese-style inn and garden. Lucy Bradford Nickerson's sister-in-law was Jane McLaughlin Bradford. Jane and her husband, Captain John Bradford, spent the majority of their married life together at sea. All told, her husband estimated that Jane traveled over 307,000 miles with him. Accompanying them on their voyages was their daughter, Ellen. The only time Ellen was not with her parents were the few years she spent in the care of an aunt while finishing high school. Ellen's memoir, entitled A Home on the Rolling Deep, is a wealth of knowledge about domestic life aboard ship. Because the Bradfords spent so much time at sea, they did not own a house of their own on land. In fact, it was not until Captain Bradford retired that they purchased property and settled down in Winchester, Massachusetts. While aboard ship, however, Jane made their accommodations as homey as possible. She even had a piano lashed to the cabin floor. There was also a small library, and always a menagerie of animals. Jane was adept at assisting her husband in his duties, often transacting business on deck while he was ashore. In a letter written aboard the ship Frederick Tudor to her brother in 1867, Jane's description of their voyage to Bombay clearly demonstrated that she understood navigation as well as any crew member. In the same letter, she also described the Bradfords' invitation to a lavish Indian wedding ceremony. One of the bonuses that made up for many of the hardships endured by mariners' wives was the extraordinary sights they witnessed. Helen May Peterson Bailey had one of the most adventurous lives of any of our Duxbury seafaring women. Her life was similar to both Jane and Ellen Bradford. Like little Ellen, she went to sea as a child, in her case at age 3, aboard her father's vessels. In her youth, she traveled to China, Russia, Hong Kong, and London. But like Jane Bradford, she then spent much of her married life aboard ship with her husband, Captain Fred Bailey of Kingston. Her first voyage as Mrs. Bailey was aboard the Nehemiah Gibson. She brought her 2 youngest children with her on this trip. Wives often had to choose which children to accompany them, especially if they had a large family. Older, school-age children were often left with family members, while infants and toddlers went with parents. Over the course of her life at sea, Helen gave birth twice aboard ship, once in Hong Kong and once in New York Harbor. Toward the end of her life, Helen penned a memoir of her life at sea. It is an invaluable resource. In it, she described how seafaring women managed even the most mundane tasks. For example, what latitudes were calm enough to take out a sewing machine, and which would have rough weather, better for hand sewing. Also, how laundry would be done during equatorial rains. She also pointed out that normal social standards didn't apply to wives in foreign harbors, writing, "Sea-going people get acquainted very easily. They don't stand back for conventions," meaning that if you stood on ceremony and waited to be introduced, you would never meet anyone in a foreign port. And there are the descriptions of all the animals that were kept aboard. For example, upon leaving the port of Singapore, Helen said they had 10 pet monkeys on board, including her own, named Pompey. As steamships began replacing sailing vessels, her husband thought it was time to retire. Of her life at sea, Helen wrote, quote, "A sea voyage is like everything else, some good things about it and some not so good. For all the storms, gales, typhoons that I have met with, I have come to the conclusion that the pleasant side of sea life far outweighs the unpleasant side." End quote. If you would like to read more about Duxbury's Women at Sea, please visit our website at www.duxburyhistory.org.